Our second speaker is Professor Markus Jaeger. He teaches at Columbia University. He's also a member of the German Council of Foreign Relations. He has a PhD from the London School of Economics, and we feel very fortunate at our center to have convinced Markus to have a long-term association with our center. He has recently affiliated as a senior advisor, and he is a member of what we call our brain trust. So together with two other professors, we talk to them every other week, consulting on the indexes and on other theoretical matters. So, Professor Jaeger.
Thank you very much. I have is to contextualize some of the research that we are doing at the center and zoom out a little bit and look at what academic debates are happening about economic development more generally, again, to contextualize the research that we'll be doing at the center. So bear with me if I'm going slow and it's a little like too basic, but I think it's important. So first of all, it is a fact that there's inequality in the world. Some countries are well off and other countries are not so well off. And that's purely if you measure it in per capita terms. So if you look, for example, at the chart on your, I guess it's on your left, you see North America is doing well, Australia is doing well, much of Europe is doing well, but broad parts of the world are doing relatively far less well. So this is a result of a very long-term historical economic process. It's clear that this has to be the result of differential growth rates over decades, even centuries, and I'll have a few words to say about this in a second. And it seems to me also fairly clear that economic growth and development is a multi-causal phenomenon. So while we be looking at a certain set of factors to evaluate what impact they will have on economic growth, I think it is important to contextualize the role of institutions in economic development and look at other factors that at least historically have had a role in determining countries' level of prosperity. And the only other thing I will say is, and I'll go into this more detail in a second, is that you'd be surprised how little consensus there is about what really brings about economic development. And I think Damon earlier on in his remarks pointed out there's a debate going on between those who think that China could be a model and others pointing out that there are liberal paths to economic development. And I also want to spend some time on this without being able to settle the debate, but just to sort of flesh out what kind of thinking is out there. And then again, once it's going to contextualize the debate on institutions and what role they might or might not play. Here, I'm afraid I might lose you, but I just want to go over some conceptual approaches as to how one can think about economic development. And I have to tell you that this is not very satisfying from my point of view. So a standard workhorse in economic development theory is the sort of a swan model. All it tells you is that economic well-being is a function of labor force growth and capital investment. And then the bit that you can't explain, that's what's called productivity. And often that's sort of seen as a sign of ignorance. So this is not a particularly helpful model. This is more like a growth accounting identity that doesn't give you much to work on in terms of explanations and causality. Perhaps a popular model also I think is relevant in the context of the debate about China is the dual sector Lewis model. Here the idea is that economic development, broadly speaking, at different levels of well-being is the outcome of low productivity labor moving from the countryside into a more productive urban sector. This is only so helpful as far as it goes because the question is, well, why should there be a productive urban sector in the first place? So it kind of begs the question, but I think it's a useful frame to think about those things. And again, that's the kind of model that you'd be looking at if you look at China and you try to explain what's going on in China and in other East Asian success stories. This is probably a model that is quite useful to get a handle of on what's happened. Much older model going back to the 1960s, the Rostow model, that's sort of interesting in the sense that here you have this notion that the public sector has to play an important role in fostering economic development. And so this then reaches into this debate on what should be the role of government, what should be the role of institutions, and what should be the role of markets. And lastly, and this is more contemporary models in terms of thinking about economic growth, the endogenous growth models. Here the idea is that growth is not static, that some of the economic growth, of course, is the result of public policies. It's a bunch of other processes like intellectual innovation that really drive productivity and economic well-being. So you see already, this is the way economists think about the world. I think this is helpful in framing the debate, but it doesn't really give you very clear-cut answers. Then there's another, I wouldn't say school of thought, but there are other studies that look at what explains differences, and they're sort of zooming out a bit from the economic theory approach. I find them quite interesting. They're perhaps not super relevant, but again, I think it is important to contextualize this. So there's this idea, for example, that well-being is to some extent a function of geography. So even if you look at the map on the left-hand side, you see that most prosperous countries are in moderate climate zones. Could be a coincidence, but there could be also some causal links here. For example, there's this idea that, let's take Russia. Russia's not as well off to some extent because rivers flow north-south. They're not very useful in terms of allowing for communication versus in Western Europe, rivers, they flow into the ocean, and that allows you access to seaborne trade, for example. There's this debate about natural resources. Are they conducive to prosperity or are they not? This is a very contentious debate. I'm not going to go into this. But it's just to give you an idea that there are many other factors that certainly, in terms of background factors, impact the level of economic well-being. There's the issue of climate. There's a very interesting study that was done that showed that to the extent that there were disease agents 200 years ago, this forced a different type of colonialism onto certain countries in what we, I guess, used to call the third world. And that to this day, these income differences that we see today are a reflection of the presence of disease agents 200 years ago. And the intuition here being is that European settlers, if they did settle in those regions, they would create extractive institutions. But what you also see here is this interesting idea that all these factors interact. So you have geography, you have the climate, you have institutions, and they all interact sort of 200 years later to produce certain outcomes. There's other research that shows that the type of colonial regime matters. French Napoleonic law versus British common law, and the British common law is supposedly superior. Again, of course, just being academics, you can always challenge those ideas, but I think it's interesting to look at this from a broader perspective. Then, of course, I think fairly straightforward, political and economic stability seems to be key. I mean, you might well have a country that has very solid institutions on paper, but perhaps it's driven by civil strife. Not very likely, but possible. So it's clear that economic stability probably is a precondition. Perhaps itself doesn't bring about prosperity, but it is an important precondition in terms of helping it bring about. Some academics talk about culture. Of course, Max Weber comes to mind, saying the Protestant work ethic really drives economic development. The Catholics are not as good at it. This is controversial stuff these days, of course, but again, sort of worthy of consideration. And then ultimately, of course, this idea of economic and political institutions. I mentioned stability. There's also this idea that political democracy leads to an economic system that is more geared towards competition. So I mentioned earlier on this idea of extractive colonialism versus settler colonialism. So there's interesting work to be done, and that's exactly what we'll be doing at the center, to really deep dive into this idea of what is the role of institutions. And I think an important question to ask, to my mind in this context, is not only if they have an impact, but how they have an impact, and to what extent they have an impact relative to these other factors. But it seems clear to me that growth being a multi-causal phenomenon, we need to consider all of those things and take a more holistic view of economic growth and development. And that brings me to my next point, which is, so when you look at the academy, a lot of debate over the past 30 years has been what might be called like market liberals, and if you will, institutionalists, or perhaps even better called like developmentalists. So the idea is that the liberals, they look at 19th century England, and they say there's a night watchman state, and all the state needs to do is really provide a stable economic and political backdrop for economic growth to occur. And so it's really economic development and well-being is a consequence of the government staying out of the economy and of just providing institutions and creating markets that are efficient and produce efficient outcomes. That's, of course, also reflected, as you probably know, here in Washington, the Washington Consensus of the 1980s and 1990s. There's a perennial debate, in a way, between liberals and well, not institutionalists, but more like state-centrist economic thinkers. On the other hand, you have this idea that the state plays a very important role in economic development today, well, in the past and today. So if you, for example, look at today's debate between the US and China about the development of new technologies, who has a superior model? Is it the United States that takes a more market-centered approach, Or is it China that takes a very sort of state-led approach to some of these technology developments? And not to belabor this point, but the difference here is that liberals are very skeptical of the government. They presume there's going to be government failure. And those who are state developmentalists, who think the state has a very important role to play in economic development, economic growth going forward, they're very skeptical, or they're worried about market failure. And so this is a very intellectual debate. The question, of course, is what does the empirical evidence show? But I thought I'd sort of flesh this out because this is, I think, very much the debate that's happening in the development space between those who think China might be a model and those who think China is absolutely not a model. I think it's much more complicated than this, but I think that's a good way to frame the debate and think about those issues. And I think to my mind, and this might be a little too theoretical, but this has a number of implications that I think are worthy of consideration, and I think the center will be looking at those. So first of all, the fact is, if we just take prosperity to mean economic growth varies big time. And sometimes it changes for no apparent reason. So give an example of a country I know quite well, Brazil. Brazil, for example, registered very high economic growth rates throughout the 2000s. Why was that? Well, it's very difficult to say. What we say was the Cardozo reforms of the 1990s. Do we say it was the political transition from a right-wing to a left-wing government? Or do we say it was the commodity price shock that really favored Brazilian exports? Probably all of the above. So I think when we do research on these topics, it's like, how do we disentangle those causal factors? I think that's one challenge. So I'm working one step further. So if you also look at the data, and if you look at meta-studies that have looked into some of those issues, the most robust result you get is that economic growth is a result of investment. I mean, this is sort of very trivial as it is, but I think, so when we think of institutions and their impact on economic well-being, I think the mechanism, the causal link in a way has to be investment, either the level of investment or the efficiency of investment. So I think that's a very cool way, well, cool, it's also a very necessary way to think about those things. So we might get correlation, but what we really also need to think about is what type of causality is involved here? And again, the question then is, how do institutions impact economic growth rather than if, and to what extent do they drive economic growth rather than if? So in a way, I think we might need to link this debate about economic well-being to a debate about what drives investment innovation. The second point I would make is, as I mentioned, economic growth seems to be very much a multi-causal phenomenon. Otherwise, it would be sort of fairly straightforward, just find one variable that explains everything. That's not, we're not that good, and it's probably impossible. And so there's one thing to find correlation and say, on average, we see that institutions or other factors lead to certain economic outcomes. The other one is really, how can we move on from statistical studies and make a stronger case? Because correlation is not causation. And my feeling is that one of the challenges that we're encountering is that sometimes it's not quite clear which way the causality runs. Does it run from economic well-being to political liberalization, or from politics or from freedom to prosperity? Or probably it runs in both directions, right? So the same way you can think of economic development as being a market-based phenomenon or a state-based phenomenon, maybe there are multiple ways in terms of which way the causality runs and which way you achieve economic prosperity. And then the last point I'll make is, and that's sort of above my pay grade, of course, but I think if you go down that path of statistical analysis, interesting, but one can take this further, then I think one interesting way to think about what kind of reforms you're proposing is, on average, certain changes to policy variables might bring, on average, certain outcomes. But if you're in a political situation, you have to ask yourself two things. As a policymaker, what change should you make to get the most important and most efficient acceleration of economic growth? So in theory, you would like to implement all these reforms. In practice, you can't for political reasons. And secondly, you have to ask yourself, what gives you the biggest bang for your buck, as it were? So once you establish that freedom matters, you still face the challenge of going out there and telling governments, okay, given your situation, you have various options, but which ones should you choose? Should you focus on political freedom, on economic freedom, or on legal freedom? So that in itself, I think, is going to require more research, and it will be very interesting to look at. And lastly, I will just say that I think the experience from the 1980s shows that a one-size-fits-all approach is not necessarily the most successful one. So I think whatever we find here, in terms of the impact of institutions' economic growth, we still have to be very sensitive of like the kind of policy advice that will be given, because the degree to which it has an impact depends very much on the context. So I'll just leave you with a quote, which comes from people much smarter than me, but I think that is useful to remember. So growth strategies are likely to differ according to domestic opportunities and constraints. And of course, there are some general abstract principles, such as property rights, rule of law, market incentives, sound money, and sustainable public finances, which are desirable. But it's the question of how do we go from these principles, from these general insights, to really have an impact in the real world? And I think here we need to be context sensitive, and only then will we be successful. Thank you very much.